The auction hammer falls. Lot 437, a Gainsborough portrait, oil on canvas, 150 years old. The Duke's family had owned it since it was painted. Going once, going twice. Sold to a Texas oil baron for less than the frame cost to gild. The year is 1949, and the contents of one of England's greatest houses are being scattered like autumn leaves. Outside, the estate walls are crumbling. Inside, rooms that once hosted kings now echo with the footsteps of auctioneers marking furniture with lot numbers. 24 hours from now, this will be an empty shell. This is happening everywhere. Across Britain, castles that stood for centuries are being gutted, abandoned, demolished with dynamite. The families who built them, names that shaped empires, are fleeing their own homes, unable to pay the bills that kept arriving, year after year after year. The aristocracy didn't fall because of revolution. They fell because of mathematics, death duties, income taxes, maintenance costs that would bankrupt small nations. This is the economic collapse nobody talks about, the one that turned a 1,000-year-old system into rubble in less than 50 years. This is the story of why British aristocrats stopped living in their castles. This is the story of the greatest wealth transfer in British history. A transfer that happened quietly, bureaucratically, through tax codes and estate sales rather than guillotines and revolution. For centuries, Britain's aristocracy lived in castles and manor houses that defined power itself. These weren't just homes. They were physical proof of an unbroken chain stretching back to William the Conqueror, to medieval knights, to families whose bloodlines were written into the very stones. 50 rooms, 100 rooms, sometimes 200, armies of servants, thousands of acres, art collections worth fortunes, libraries that universities envied. And then between 1900 and 1950 it collapsed, not slowly, not gently, with shocking speed. By 1955, one country house in Britain was being demolished every 5 days. Demolished, blown up with dynamite, torn down for scrap. Paintings sold to American museums, land parceled off to developers, families with titles older than most nations reduced to living in the servants' wing while tourists trooped through their ancestral dining rooms. The tour guides don't tell you this part. They talk about architecture, about history, about the glittering balls and royal visits. They don't explain the spreadsheets, the mounting debts, the impossible choice between selling a Rembrandt or closing another wing of the house to save on coal. But beneath every marble floor, behind every portrait gallery, the same brutal arithmetic was at work. These houses cost a fortune to maintain, and the money that had sustained them for generations, the rents, the investments, the quiet accumulations of wealth was being systematically drained away by a government that had decided the age of aristocracy was over. This is the untold story of Britain's castles, not the romantic version, the real one. About what happens when beauty becomes a burden, when history becomes a trap, and when the people who own palaces discover that ownership isn't the same as being able to afford to live in them. This is the story of economic collapse dressed in limestone and oak, the death of old money. And the question that haunts every empty corridor, who actually pays when empires fall? The morning begins at 4:30. In the basement of Chatsworth House, Derbyshire, coal heavers are already awake, shoveling fuel into boilers that heat 175 rooms. By 5, the first housemaids are moving through corridors with buckets of water and bundles of kindling. By 6:30, fireplaces must be lit, swept clean of yesterday's ash, and burning steadily before the family wakes. This is 1910. The sun hasn't risen. The work has already been underway for 90 minutes. Chatsworth employs 300 people just to keep the building alive. 300. Not to throw parties, not to entertain guests, simply to maintain baseline function. Heat, light, food, clean linens. The basic operations of a structure that covers 35,000 square feet and sits on 35,000 acres of land. And this is one house. Across Britain, hundreds of estates operate on the same model, burning through staff and resources at a pace that would horrify modern accountants. The question nobody was asking yet, but would soon be forced to answer, was simple and devastating. What happens when the money runs out? The numbers are staggering when laid out plainly. A great house in Edwardian England required approximately one servant for every 2 to 3 rooms. Blenheim Palace, with 187 rooms, employed between 60 and 80 indoor staff alone. Longleat House needed 43 indoor servants just for daily operations. The Duke of Westminster's Eaton Hall required 50 gardeners, not total staff, just gardeners to maintain the grounds. Wages varied by position, but even at the lower end, a housemaid earned £12 to £18 annually. A butler commanded £50 to £80. A head chef could demand £100 or more. Multiply those figures across dozens of positions, and the annual wage bill for a single estate easily reached £3,002 to £5,000, equivalent to roughly £400,000 to £650,000 in today's currency. And that was just salaries. The operational expenses extended far beyond payroll. Coal consumption alone was astronomical. Heating a property the size of Chatsworth during winter required several tons of coal per week, delivered by cart, unloaded by hand, stored in cellars, and fed constantly into those basement boilers. Candles, lamp oil, and later gas and electricity represented another massive ongoing cost. Food provisioning for both family and staff meant daily deliveries of meat, vegetables, dairy, and bread. Many estates maintained their own kitchen gardens, game larders, and dairy operations, but these required yet more staff to operate. Laundry involved industrial-scale washing, drying, ironing, and mending work so labor-intensive that larger houses employed 10 or more laundry maids working in dedicated buildings separate from the main house. Then came maintenance. Stone masonry crumbles, lead roofing develops leaks, window frames rot, plaster cracks, damp creeps into walls. Every great house was engaged in a constant, expensive battle against entropy. The 9th Duke of Devonshire's diaries from this period are filled with anxious notes about repair costs. £800 for roof work, £1 sow 200 for repointing stonework, £600 for repairing water damage in the staterooms. These weren't occasional expenses but annual necessities. Neglect one year and the costs doubled the next. The arithmetic was becoming impossible. Agricultural rents, the traditional financial foundation of aristocratic wealth, had been in decline since the 1870s, when cheap grain from America and the British Empire flooded the market. What had once produced £50,000 IO annually from tenant farms might now yield £30,000 IO or less. Meanwhile, estate expenses remained fixed or increased. The gap widened every year. Families began selling off portions of their art collections, auctioning heirloom furniture, liquidating land. Some borrowed heavily. Others married American heiresses whose fathers' industrial fortunes could temporarily plug the hemorrhaging finances. But money alone couldn't solve the deeper problem. The model itself was obsolete. These houses had been designed for a world where labor was cheap, energy was wood or coal, and social hierarchy was unquestioned. That world was ending. The people lighting those fires before dawn were beginning to ask why. For 800 years, the mathematics had been straightforward. Aristocratic families owned land. Tenant farmers rented that land, paying rents that flowed upward to the estate coffers. The landowner took his cut, maintained the property, lived well, and passed it all to his son. The system was stable because land was the ultimate asset, fixed, productive, impossible to lose unless you committed treason or died without heirs. But between 1870 and 1900, something broke. American grain flooded British markets, shipped across the Atlantic in new steam-powered vessels that made transportation cheap and fast. British wheat prices collapsed. Tenant farmers who had paid reliable rents for generations suddenly couldn't make ends meet. They fell behind. They abandoned leases. They emigrated. And the great estates, structured around agricultural income that had seemed as permanent as bedrock, watched their revenue streams dry up. Rents that had sustained entire dynasties started to fail. Yet the costs those 300 servants, those endless repairs, those thousands of tons of coal kept climbing. The aristocracy's economic foundation was crumbling decades before anyone outside the system noticed. By 1900, some of the oldest families in England were already in quiet financial distress, selling art, cutting staff, closing wings of their homes, and praying the crisis would pass. It would not pass. It would accelerate. The scale of the collapse can be measured in ledgers still preserved in estate archives. The Duke of Bedford's Woburn Abbey collected £141,000 in agricultural rents in 1878. By 1895, that figure had dropped to £86,000, a loss of nearly 40% in less than 2 decades. The Marquis of Bute's Welsh estate saw rents plummet from £350,000 in the early 1870s to £200,000 by century's end. These weren't minor adjustments. These were catastrophic revenue losses for organizations whose expenses were essentially fixed. You couldn't simply dismiss half the staff when half the income disappeared, or rather, you could. But then, who would maintain the buildings, tend the grounds, prepare the meals? The root cause was brutally simple. Globalization before anyone called it that. The American Great Plains and Canadian prairies were producing wheat at scales British farmers couldn't match. Vast mechanized farms using new harvesting equipment could deliver grain to Liverpool or London cheaper than a Lincolnshire tenant farmer could grow it 50 miles away. Refrigerated shipping added insult to injury. Now Australian mutton and Argentine beef competed with British livestock. Farmers who had worked the same land for generations found themselves economically obsolete through no fault of their own. Some estates tried to adapt. They shifted from grain to dairy, from arable farming to livestock, from tenant farming to direct management. The problem was that adaptation required capital investment precisely when capital was scarce. Converting farmland to pasture, building new barns, purchasing breeding stock, all of this cost money at a moment when rents were falling and reserves were depleting. Many landowners, trained from birth to manage inherited wealth rather than generate new income, simply lacked the business acumen to navigate the crisis. They continued managing their estates as their fathers and grandfathers had, hoping market conditions would revert to historical norms. They didn't. Instead, the situation worsened. Rural depopulation accelerated as agricultural workers left for industrial cities or emigrated to the colonies. Entire villages shrank. Parish churches that had served hundreds now ministered to dozens. The social fabric that had sustained the landed system, deference, tradition, mutual obligation, began fraying. When tenant farmers struggled, they no longer automatically blamed themselves or bad weather. They began questioning why they should pay rents to absentee landlords who contributed nothing to actual production. Meanwhile, taxation began its long climb upward. The 1894 Finance Act introduced progressive death duties. For the first time, estates worth over £1 million faced an 8% tax on inheritance. It seemed modest then. Within 2 decades, war would push that rate above 40%. The aristocracy was being squeezed from both sides, falling income below, rising taxes above. And in the middle sat those vast, hungry houses, demanding to be fed with resources that were rapidly running out. Some families recognized the mathematics and acted decisively, selling land while it still held value, diversifying into industrial investments, marrying wealth from commerce or America. Others, bound by pride, tradition, or simple inability to imagine a different world, simply held on and hoped, watching their ancestral patrimony slowly dissolve around them. The budget debate in Parliament was vicious. David Lloyd George, Chancellor of the Exchequer, stood before the House of Commons and proposed something that seemed, to the aristocracy, like outright confiscation. A new tax on land. A tax on land value, on unearned income, on inherited wealth, and most devastating of all, death duties. When an aristocrat died, his heirs would now owe the government a percentage of the estate's value. Not a token, a serious percentage. The wealthy fought back hard. The House of Lords, dominated by landed peers whose own estates would be gutted by these measures, blocked the budget for months. Constitutional crisis loomed. The king had to intervene. Eventually, the budget passed, and with it, a fundamental truth was encoded into law. The British government no longer believed aristocratic wealth should be protected simply because it was old. The immediate effects were manageable. Death duties started at modest rates, but they were structured to rise, and they were cumulative. Every time an estate passed from father to son, every generation another slice was taken. For families whose wealth was locked into land, art, and buildings that couldn't be easily liquidated, this created a ticking clock. The estates that had survived wars, plagues, political upheavals, and dynastic feuds were about to be taken down by accountants, tax collectors, and spreadsheets that didn't care about history. Lloyd George didn't hide his intentions. In speeches across the country, he framed the budget explicitly as class warfare, his term, not his opponents. He spoke about dukes who owned vast tracts of land they'd never worked, who collected rents from families who actually produced value, who lived in absurd luxury while coal miners died in collapsing shafts and factory workers struggled to feed their children. A fully equipped duke, he told a rally in Newcastle, costs as much to keep up as 2 dreadnoughts, and dukes are just as great a terror and they last longer. The crowds roared. The aristocracy was horrified, not just by the policy but by the rhetoric. This wasn't respectful disagreement between gentlemen. This was open contempt for the entire social order. The constitutional crisis that followed was unprecedented in modern British history. The House of Lords had traditionally held veto power over legislation, including finance bills. When the peers rejected the People's Budget in November 1909, they triggered a standoff that threatened the fundamental operations of government. Parliament dissolved. 2 general elections were called in 1910 January and December, both fought largely over this single issue. Should hereditary aristocrats have the power to block legislation passed by elected representatives? The Liberal government argued no. The Conservative opposition, backed by the Lords, argued that rapid social transformation threatened British stability. The Liberals won both elections, though with reduced majorities. King Edward VII died in May 1910, and his son George V inherited not just the throne but an active constitutional crisis. Prime Minister Asquith eventually forced the king's hand, threatened to create hundreds of new Liberal peers who would vote to strip the Lords of their veto, or the Lords must capitulate. Faced with the prospect of their chamber being swamped with new creations brewers, industrialists, newspaper proprietors elevated purely to destroy aristocratic power, the Lords surrendered. The Parliament Act of 1911 removed their veto over money bills and reduced their power over other legislation to a 2-year delay. The aristocracy had lost the political battle. Now came the financial reckoning. Death duties under the 1909 budget started at 1% for estates over £100 and rose to a maximum of 15% for estates exceeding £1 million. This seems almost quaint compared to modern inheritance taxes, but the impact was devastating for families whose entire wealth consisted of illiquid assets. When the 9th Duke of Devonshire died in 1908, just before the new duties took effect, his heir inherited Chatsworth intact. When estates began passing after 1909, heirs faced impossible choices. Sell land to pay the tax, which reduced future income, or borrow against the estate, which created debt service obligations that further strained already declining revenues. The cumulative effect was what made death duties truly destructive. A 15% tax didn't sound catastrophic for a single generation. But apply it twice in 30 years: father dies, son inherits and pays 15%. Then son dies and grandson pays another 15% on what remains, and suddenly you've extracted nearly 30% of the estate's value in just 3 decades. For families accustomed to thinking in centuries, this represented existential threat. The clock was ticking now, and every death started a countdown to forced sales, broken collections, and demolished wings that could no longer be maintained. The lists of the dead read like a directory of the aristocracy. Eldest sons, heirs to dukedoms and earldoms, killed at the Somme, at Ypres, at Pastiandale. Junior officers, leading men over the top, cut down by machine gun fire in the first minutes of an attack. By 1918, entire family lines had been severed. The Earl of Something's heir, dead. The Duke of Somewhere Else's two sons, both dead. Younger brothers pressed into service as reluctant heirs to estates they had never expected to inherit. The human cost was staggering. But the economic impact on the estates was also severe. Young men who should have been managing land, making investment decisions, modernizing operations gone. Replaced by aging fathers, shell-shocked survivors, or distant cousins who barely knew the properties they now controlled. And then there were the servants. The young footmen, hall boys, grooms, gamekeepers who had kept the estates running they enlisted too. Many didn't return. Those who did often refused to go back into service. They had seen the world, survived trenches, been promised a country fit for heroes. Polishing silver in a duke's pantry didn't feel heroic anymore. The entire servant class that had made aristocratic life possible was evaporating. By 1920, families who once employed 50 found themselves struggling to hire 10. Wages rose. Expectations changed. The old deference was dying with the men who might have carried it forward. The casualty figures tell part of the story. Of the peers and sons of peers who served, 1 in 5 died, a mortality rate roughly equivalent to junior officers overall, which makes sense since aristocratic privilege still meant commissions. But the concentration of loss in certain families was devastating. Lord and Lady Desborough lost 2 of their 3 sons within months in 1915. The Earl of Wemyss lost his heir and grandson. Some ancient titles passed to distant relatives who had lived ordinary middle-class lives and suddenly found themselves responsible for crumbling estates they could neither afford nor understand. The financial drain of the war compounded everything else. The government imposed war loans that wealthy families were expected, practically required, to purchase. Income tax, which had been 9 pence in the pound before the war, rose to 6 shillings, an 8-fold increase. Super tax on high incomes climbed steadily. Families already struggling with declining rents and rising costs now faced tax bills that consumed half or more of their nominal income. Estate maintenance was deferred, there were no workers available anyway, and materials were diverted to war production. Roofs leaked, gardens went untended. Houses requisitioned for military hospitals or convalescent homes suffered hard use and minimal upkeep. But the servant crisis was perhaps the most immediate and visible catastrophe. Before the war, domestic service had been Britain's largest employment category after agriculture. Young women from rural areas had few alternative service offered: room, board, and a small wage. Young men might work as hall boys or stable hands before moving into trades. The war changed the calculus entirely. Women discovered they could work in munitions factories for higher wages and more freedom. Men returned from France having commanded soldiers, operated machinery, seen London or even Paris. The thought of returning to a hierarchy where they couldn't speak unless spoken to, couldn't marry without permission, had to use separate staircases, and wear livery it was intolerable. Families tried everything. They raised wages, which strained budgets further. They relaxed rules about followers and time off. They hired married couples, something previously rare. It didn't matter. A 1919 survey found that 2/3 of former domestic servants refused to return to the profession. Those who did service demanded radically different conditions: afternoons off, private rooms, no uniforms, wages double what they'd earned in 1914. The arithmetic became impossible. A house that needed 20 servants to function properly could afford only 12, could find only 8, and those 8 expected to work half the hours their predecessors had. The physical consequences were immediate and visible. Staterooms stopped being opened except for rare occasions. Dust covers went over furniture and stayed there. Entire wings closed. Families consolidated into apartments within their own houses, heating and maintaining only the rooms they actually occupied. The great entertaining that had justified these enormous buildings, house parties lasting weeks, balls for hundreds, shooting parties with dozens of guests, simply stopped. The staff didn't exist to support it, and the money didn't exist to pay for it. What the aristocracy discovered, too late, was that their world had required a specific ecosystem to function. It needed cheap labor, cheap energy, agricultural rents, social deference, and tax-free inheritance. Remove any one element and the system strained. Remove several simultaneously and it collapsed. The war had removed them all at once. By 1920, the question wasn't whether the great estates would survive. It was which ones would die first and how much could be saved from the wreckage. On the surface, the 1920s brought relief. The war was over. Markets stabilized. Some aristocratic families even seemed to be recovering, throwing parties again, opening their London houses for the season, maintaining appearances. But appearances were all it was. Behind closed doors, ledgers told a different story. Borrowing, mortgages taken against land. Art quietly sold through private dealers to avoid public scandal. Corners cut, staff reductions justified as temporary, maintenance deferred because this year's budget simply couldn't stretch. And the tax bills kept growing. Death duties raised again. Income taxes on rents that were already diminished. Local rates on properties that generated no income but still demanded upkeep. Some families tried to adapt. They opened their houses for public tours, charging admission an idea that felt humiliating to people whose ancestors had entertained monarchs. Others married American heiresses, trading ancient titles for fresh cash injections from railroad and industrial fortunes built across the Atlantic. It worked for some. The Duke of Marlborough married Consuelo Vanderbilt, whose dowry saved Blenheim Palace. But not every family had a daughter or son attractive enough to land a millionaire. And even successful marriages only delayed the inevitable, because the fundamental problem wasn't solved. The castles still cost more to run than they generated. And the structure of British taxation was now designed, deliberately or not, to dismantle concentrated aristocratic wealth one generation at a time. The art sales reveal the quiet desperation. Christie's and Sotheby's handled dozens of aristocratic dispersals through the 1920s, though many were conducted with careful discretion. Family portraits might be sold privately to American collectors. Renaissance paintings went to newly established museums. Entire libraries' first editions, medieval manuscripts, collections assembled over centuries were auctioned to raise cash for tax bills or urgent repairs. The 9th Duke of Marlborough sold his Blenheim gem collection in 1925 for £100,000. The Duke of Hamilton disposed of a Velázquez and other masterworks. These weren't frivolous luxuries being liquidated, they were patrimony, pieces of family identity being severed and scattered to keep the roofs from collapsing. Land sales accelerated even more dramatically. In the decade after the war, approximately 1/4 of England changed hands, the largest transfer of land since the Norman conquest. Estates that had been intact for 400 years were broken up and sold piecemeal. Tenant farmers, now able to access credit more easily, bought the farms they'd been renting. Speculators purchased agricultural land for development. Urban expansion consumed estates on the edges of growing cities. The families selling tried to frame it as strategic reduction, rationalizing holdings, focusing on core properties. In reality, they were selling anything they could to raise the cash to pay death duties, settle debts, and cover operating losses on the houses they kept. The American marriages became almost a cottage industry. Between 1870 and 1914, approximately 100 American heiresses married British aristocrats, but the pace accelerated in the 1920s. It was a transaction both sides understood clearly. The American family gained social prestige and entry into British high society. The British family gained desperately needed liquidity. Consuelo Vanderbilt's marriage to the 9th Duke of Marlborough, arranged by her socially ambitious mother, despite Consuelo's own wishes, brought a dowry equivalent to roughly £2.5 million today. That money went straight into Blenheim's restoration and maintenance. But the marriages were often unhappy. Class expectations clashed with American independence. The women found themselves isolated in drafty houses, bound by social rules they found absurd, married to men who viewed them primarily as FINAN, CIAL, Chinese letter, RAFTs. Some families tried modernization. The Earl of Ivog installed central heating at Elvedon Hall. The Duke of Sutherland experimented with commercial forestry on his Scottish estates. A few attempted agricultural innovation, mechanization, new crop varieties, scientific farming methods. But these required capital investment precisely when capital was scarce, and the returns were uncertain and long-term, while the bills were immediate and certain. The public tours represented a particularly bitter compromise. In 1920, the Duke of Devonshire reluctantly opened Chatsworth to paying visitors on select days. Entrance cost 1 shilling. Visitors walked through staterooms, gawked at paintings, commented on the furniture. For families raised to believe their homes were private sanctuaries where they were masters of everything they surveyed, this felt like prostitution selling access to strangers, commodifying ancestral heritage. But 1 shilling per visitor, multiplied by thousands of visitors per season, meant money for repairs that couldn't be funded any other way. The fundamental economics remained broken. Operating expenses stayed high while revenue sources contracted. Death duties ensured that each generational transfer extracted another chunk of capital. The tax structure treated these estates as vast stores of wealth to be redistributed, which in asset terms they were, but the assets were illiquid, and the income they generated was declining. You couldn't pay a £50,000 tax bill with a Rembrandt unless you sold the Rembrandt, and once you sold it, it was gone forever. The aristocracy was being liquidated slowly, methodically, legally, and the 1920s, for all their apparent gaiety, were just an intermission before the final act. The stock market crashed in 1929, and this time there was no pretending. Portfolios that aristocratic families had quietly relied on to supplement failing agricultural rents evaporated overnight. Investments in railways, in colonial ventures, in government bonds, all suddenly worth a fraction of their former value. Banks that had extended credit to landed families started calling in loans. Credit dried up, and across the British countryside, the crisis reached the breaking point. Families who had been quietly struggling now faced immediate catastrophe. Estates that had been maintained for 400 years were put up for sale. Entire contents, furniture, paintings, libraries auctioned off. In some cases, the houses themselves were demolished, the stones sold for building material, the land broken up and sold piecemeal to whoever would buy it. The statistics are stark. Between 1918 and 1940, approximately a quarter of England changed hands. Not through inheritance, through forced sale. 1 in 4 acres. Families who had owned land since the Norman conquest lost it to tax bills, to debt, to the simple inability to keep paying. And crucially, many buyers weren't aristocrats. They were businessmen, industrialists, developers, people who saw land as an investment, not a sacred trust. The old system of hereditary landowning was breaking apart, and the great houses, no longer viable as family homes, faced a brutal question. What use is a 200-room castle in a world that no longer supports castles? The demolitions are the most visceral evidence of what was happening. Clumber Park in Nottinghamshire, a house with 140 rooms, built by the Dukes of Newcastle, demolished in 1938. The family couldn't afford the estimated £50,000 needed for essential repairs and couldn't find a buyer willing to take on the burden. Workmen spent months dismantling what had taken years to build. Eaton Hall, the Duke of Westminster's palatial seat in Cheshire, was too large to demolish entirely, but was substantially reduced, whole wings torn down, the remainder radically simplified. Hamilton Palace in Scotland, one of the grandest houses in Britain, was demolished in 1927 due to subsidence and the impossibility of funding repairs. These weren't minor country houses. These were architectural landmarks, repositories of art and history, buildings that had defined their regions for centuries. The auction catalogues from this period read like obituaries. The entire contents of Trentham Hall in 1907. Stowe House, important sale of pictures, furniture and effects, spread across multiple sessions in 1921 and 1922. Mentmore towers the Rosebery collection in phases through the 1930s. Each auction dispersed collections that had been assembled over generations. A Louis XV writing desk that had been in the family since 1780 went to a London dealer. A Gainsborough portrait of a family ancestor ended up in an American museum. Medieval armor, Georgian silver, entire libraries of rare books all scattered. Museums acquired what they could afford. Wealthy collectors bought conversation pieces. Much of it simply disappeared into private hands, never to be publicly seen again. The families themselves made impossible choices. Do you sell the London townhouse to save the country estate or vice versa? Do you demolish the West Wing to reduce maintenance costs on the portion you keep? Do you accept the humiliation of commercial use, turning your ballroom into a wedding venue, your grounds into a golf course, your stables into a garage? Some families retreated into small corners of their own houses, living in what had been servants' quarters, while the staterooms sat empty and cold. Others abandoned the country estates entirely, moving to modest homes in market towns or emigrating to Kenya, Canada, anywhere the cost of living was lower and aristocratic failure less publicly visible. The buyers, when they could be found, represented a fundamental shift in British society. Self-made industrialists who wanted country estates as status symbols but had no interest in traditional responsibilities. Developers who saw valuable building land and viewed the historic houses as obstacles to be removed. Institutions, schools, hospitals, government departments that could use large buildings but had no interest in preserving their character. The National Trust, founded in 1895, began accepting country houses in the 1930s as desperate families sought any alternative to demolition. But the trust was selective and had limited resources. It couldn't save everything. It couldn't save most things. The human cost ran parallel to the architectural devastation. Estate workers who had spent entire lives in service to these families suddenly found themselves unemployed as houses closed or changed hands. Gamekeepers, gardeners, foresters' men whose fathers and grandfathers had held the same positions were turned out with minimal severance and few transferable skills. Entire villages that had existed symbiotically with great estates for centuries lost their economic anchors. The social fabric disintegrated along with the buildings. What makes the Depression-era collapse particularly significant is its finality. After previous crises, recovery had been possible, markets rebounded, agricultural conditions improved, but the 1930s made clear that this wasn't a cyclical downturn, it was permanent structural change. The economic model that supported great estates no longer existed. The social framework that justified them was gone. The political will to protect them had evaporated. The houses that survived would need entirely new justifications for existing. Most wouldn't find them. The letter arrived from the War Office with little warning. The house was being requisitioned. Officers needed quarters. Troops needed billets. The government was taking over, and the family could either cooperate or face formal seizure. Across Britain, hundreds of country houses were commandeered for war use. Some became military hospitals. Some became training schools. Some housed government offices evacuated from London during the Blitz. The families, if they stayed at all, were confined to a handful of rooms, watching as soldiers tramped through ancestral halls in muddy boots, as makeshift partitions divided ballrooms into dormitories, as plaster cracked and floors buckled under weights they were never designed to bear. The government paid rent, token amounts, nowhere near enough to cover damage or maintenance. When the war ended in 1945, families returning to their homes found devastation. Floors ruined, paneling torn out for firewood, leaks in roofs that had gone unrepaired for 6 years, mold creeping up walls, grounds turned into vehicle parks, lawns rutted by tank treads. The bill to restore these properties to anything resembling their pre-war condition would have been astronomical. Most families didn't have the money. The war itself had driven taxes higher. Death duties had been raised again to fund the war effort. And now, in 1945, Britain had a new government. Labour, elected on a platform of social transformation, redistribution, the welfare state. The aristocracy, already on its knees, was about to face a government that saw them not as a national treasure, but as a problem to be solved. The scope of requisition was enormous. By 1944, approximately 1,000 country houses were in government hands. Bletchley Park, the code-breaking centre that helped win the war, operated from a requisitioned Victorian mansion. Wilton House became a headquarters for Southern Command. Longleat housed evacuated schools. Woburn Abbey held various military departments. Some families volunteered their houses, hoping cooperation would mean better treatment. Others resisted until compelled by official order. It made little difference. Once the military moved in, the buildings suffered. The damage took multiple forms. Heavy use was the most obvious. Buildings designed for a family, and perhaps 30 servants now accommodated hundreds of soldiers, administrators, patients, or students. Floors sagged under the weight. Plumbing systems designed for Victorian-era loads failed under modern demand. Electrical wiring, hastily installed for military needs, often violated every standard of safety. But there was also willful destruction born of class resentment. Soldiers who had grown up in tenements or terraced houses, now occupying palaces, sometimes took a certain satisfaction in carelessness. Cigarette burns in priceless furniture, names carved into paneling, paint splashed on marble fireplaces. Not universal, but common enough that returning owners found evidence throughout their homes. The requisition payments were deliberately minimal. The government argued it was paying fair market rent for properties that had no civilian use during wartime. Families argued correctly that fair rent should include compensation for inevitable damage and deferred maintenance. The government disagreed. Typical compensation might be £500 per year for a house that would require £1000 in repairs once returned. Some families tried to negotiate. Others simply accepted, knowing they had no leverage. Refusing requisition could result in outright seizure with no compensation at all. When families did return in 1945 and 1946, the scope of damage became clear. Uttingham Park came back with severe dry rot throughout, the result of broken gutters left unrepaired for 6 years. The 10th Duke of Devonshire returned to Hardwicke Hall to find floors collapsed, windows broken, and water damage throughout. Floors at numerous houses had buckled under heavy equipment. Gardens that had been meticulously maintained for centuries were obliterated, torn up for vehicle access, dug up for air raid shelters, simply neglected into wilderness. Ancient trees had been felled for firewood or to clear sightlines. Ornamental lakes had been drained and filled with rubble. The cost of restoration far exceeded what most families could afford. And this coincided precisely with the post-war tax increases that made recovery impossible. Death duties, which had been 15% in 1909 and raised to 40% during the First World War, were pushed to 75% on the largest estates by 1946. Income tax reached 19 shillings sixpence in the pound, nearly 98% on the highest incomes. Surtax added further burden. A family deriving £20,000 per year in rent might see £18,000 disappear to taxes, leaving £2,000 disappear to taxes, leaving £2,000 for maintenance, staff and personal expenses on a property requiring £10,000 annually, just to prevent further deterioration. The 1945 Labour government's attitude toward country houses was not hostile in a personal sense, but it was unsentimental. Housing shortages were acute. The National Health Service needed facilities, schools needed expansion. Country houses represented underutilized resources in a nation desperate for space and struggling with post-war reconstruction. When aristocratic families appealed for tax relief or compensation for war damage, they received polite refusals. The government's priority was building the welfare state, not preserving aristocratic heritage. The result was a second wave of demolitions, even more severe than the 1930s. Between 1945 and 1955, Britain lost approximately one country house every 5 days to demolition. Hundreds of architecturally significant buildings simply disappeared. The families made pragmatic calculations. A house requiring pound 100,000 in repairs that they couldn't afford was worth more demolished, the materials sold, the land freed from crushing maintenance obligations. The war had given the houses a temporary reprieve. It's hard to demolish a building when the government is using it. But that reprieve proved to be merely a delay before final execution. The calculation was simple and brutal. When an aristocrat died, his heir now owed the government up to 80% of the estate's assessed value. 80%, not of liquid assets, of everything. The house, the land, the art, the furniture. Everything was valued, everything was taxed, and the tax had to be paid within a year. For estates whose wealth was almost entirely tied up in property that couldn't easily be sold, this was a death sentence. You couldn't sell 80% of a house. You couldn't liquidate 80% of a 1,000-acre park. The only options were to sell off the parts that could be sold: paintings, furniture, portions of land to pay the bill. And with every generation, another 80% slice was taken. Run the math forward. A great house changes hands every 30 years on average. First generation, 80% gone. Second generation, 80% of what's left. Third generation, 80% again. Within a century, the estate has been reduced to almost nothing. This wasn't a natural decline. It was structural demolition, encoded into tax law, carried out with bureaucratic efficiency. The government never had to seize the houses. They just had to wait. Families with no cash reserves were forced to sell. Art went to American museums. Land went to developers. Houses, stripped of contents, stood empty. Some families fought to hold on, opening their homes to tourists, running them as businesses, doing anything to generate enough income to pay the bills. It worked for a handful: Blenheim, Chatsworth, Harewood. A few dozen survived by transforming from private homes into heritage attractions. But hundreds more didn't make it. The demolition crews came. The wrecking balls swung. Castles that had stood for 500 years were reduced to rubble in an afternoon. The mechanics of asset stripping became grimly routine. A peer dies. The estate is valued by government assessors who often had little understanding of or sympathy for the complications of valuing historic property. They might value a capability brown landscape at agricultural rates, ignoring that it couldn't legally be developed. They might assess artwork at auction prices without accounting for the flooded market when dozens of aristocratic families were simultaneously selling collections, prices inevitably depressed. But the valuations once set determined the tax bill, and the bill was non-negotiable. Families attempted various strategies to survive. Some had already transferred artwork to trusts or gifted land to heirs years before death, hoping to avoid taxation. The government responded with new rules about gifts made within a certain number of years. Before death, those would be taxed too. Some tried to argue that houses should be valued not at replacement cost, but at realistic market value, which for a 40-bedroom mansion requiring pound 50,000 in annual maintenance was often close to zero. The government generally rejected such arguments. The assessors looked at what the building and land would cost to replace and taxed accordingly, regardless of whether anyone would actually buy it at that price. The sales followed predictable patterns. First went the London townhouses. These at least had genuine market value as embassies, corporate headquarters, or luxury apartments. Then the peripheral land farms that could be sold to sitting tenants or developers. Then the contents. Entire collections went to auction at Christie's and Sotheby's. The 7th Earl of Harewood sold his Italian masters to the Leeds City Art Gallery to raise funds. The Duke of Marlborough sold more of Blenheim's collections. Library after library was dispersed. American universities and museums, flush with post-war dollars, bought extensively. The Huntington Library in California, the Getty in Los Angeles, the Met in New York all benefited enormously from British aristocratic financial distress. What remained after these sales often couldn't support itself. A house denuded of its artwork and finest furniture, sitting on reduced acreage, still required heating, roofing, staffing. The revenue from tourism, even when families swallowed their pride and opened to the public, rarely covered costs. A house that attracted 20,000 visitors per year, at 5 shillings each grossed pound 5,000, perhaps enough to patch the roof, not enough to prevent slow deterioration everywhere else. The demolitions of the 1950s and early 1960s represented the culmination of this process. Houses that had survived requisition, survived war damage, survived initial post-war tax bills, finally succumbed when the next generation inherited. The pattern was consistent. Peer dies, heir assesses damage and tax bill, heir realizes restoration is impossible, heir negotiates demolition. Sometimes the materials had value lead from roofs, stone from walls, timber from floors. Sometimes the house was simply bulldozed and the rubble buried on site. Northwick Park in Gloucestershire, Barlaston Hall in Staffordshire, Trent Park in Middlesex, Agecroft Hall dismantled, shipped to America and rebuilt in Virginia. These weren't ruins claimed by time. These were conscious decisions to destroy, driven by financial mathematics that left no alternative. The human dimension often gets lost in these statistics. These were family homes, despite their scale. Children had grown up in these rooms. Generations of memories were embedded in the architecture. Walking away from or destroying a house that had been in the family for 300 years was traumatic, regardless of the financial necessity. Letters and diaries from this period reveal the emotional toll: shame, grief, anger, resignation. Some heirs felt they'd failed their ancestors by being the generation that lost everything. Others felt bitter relief at escaping an impossible burden. Few felt the outcome was just. By 1974, when death duties were reformed into the modern inheritance tax system, the damage was done. The great redistribution of British land and wealth was largely complete. What survived did so either through exceptional financial management, transformation into commercial enterprises, or acceptance of national trust ownership. The rest was simply gone. The explosion echoed across the valley. Tintersfield House, Somerset, one of the finest Victorian Gothic mansions in England, stood intact one moment and crumbled the next. The family couldn't afford to maintain it. No buyer could be found who would take on the costs. So they demolished it. This wasn't rare. This wasn't a scandal. This was normal. Between 1945 and 1974, approximately one country house was demolished in Britain every 5 days. Not small houses. Great houses. Architectural masterpieces. Buildings designed by the finest architects of their age, filled with plasterwork, paneling and craftsmanship that would cost millions to replicate. Gorna. In some cases the stone was salvaged and sold. In others, it was simply smashed and buried. Stained glass windows shattered. Oak staircases burned. Libraries dispersed, books scattered to auction houses if the family had time, or simply junked if they didn't. Photographs from the era show surreal scenes, half a house still standing, the other half reduced to rubble, drawing rooms open to the sky. Staircases leading to nothing. The demolition was partly economic, cheaper to tear down than maintain. But it was also psychological. Families who had lived in these houses for generations couldn't bear to see them pass to strangers. Better to destroy them than watch them become hotels, conference centers, or worse, subdivided into apartments. And the government didn't stop it. Sometimes they even encouraged it. Demolition removed a property from the tax rolls, ended a maintenance burden. From a certain bureaucratic perspective, fewer castles meant fewer problems. The destruction only slowed when preservationists began to fight back, when groups like the National Trust started accepting country houses as donations, taking on the burden of maintenance in exchange for preserving them as heritage. But by then, hundreds were already gone, and thousands more were at risk. The architectural losses were staggering. Wentworth Woodhouse in Yorkshire, the largest private house in Britain, with over 600 rooms and a facade longer than Buckingham Palace, survived, but only barely, after portions were demolished and decades of neglect. Others weren't so fortunate. Aldwark Manor, designed by John Carr, demolished in 1957. Blount's Court in Wiltshire, a Tudor mansion, gone in 1955. Nuthall Temple in Nottinghamshire, an early Georgian masterpiece with interiors by Salvin, destroyed in 1929. These weren't minor losses. These were buildings that represented the pinnacle of British architectural achievement, irreplaceable examples of craftsmanship from eras when labour was cheap and quality was paramount. The demolition process itself was often brutal and hasty. Contractors would strip anything valuable first lead from roofs fetched good prices, so did carved stone mantels, wrought iron gates, even usable timber. Salvage firms specialized in this work, moving through condemned houses like scavengers, pulling out anything marketable before the wrecking crews arrived. What they left behind was destroyed with remarkable efficiency. Wrecking balls swung through walls that had stood for centuries. Explosives brought down structures too large for mechanical demolition. Bulldozers pushed rubble into basements, covering the foundations, leaving barely a trace that anything had existed. The photographic record of these demolitions is haunting. Country Life magazine and local photographers documented many, creating archives of beautiful interiors days or hours before destruction. Plasterwork ceilings by Italian craftsmen, commissioned in the 1720s and maintained for 2 centuries, photographed one final time before sledgehammers reduced them to dust. Libraries with hand-carved bookcases and painted ceilings, emptied of books, waiting for demolition. Long galleries where generations had walked, now stripped of portraits, daylight streaming through broken windows onto scarred floors. These images capture something more than architectural loss. They capture cultural erasure, the physical destruction of tangible links to British history. Some families tried alternative solutions before resorting to demolition. They offered houses to the government as gifts the government usually refused, unwilling to take on maintenance costs. They approached charities, universities, hospitals. Most had neither resources nor interest. They advertised internationally, hoping American or European buyers might want a piece of British heritage. Occasionally this worked. William Randolph Hearst purchased entire rooms from British houses, had them dismantled, shipped to California, and installed at San Simeon. But most houses were too large, too expensive, too impractical to transport. The psychological dimension was complex. Some family members were devastated, viewing demolition as personal failure and betrayal of ancestral trust. Others felt profound relief. The burden of maintaining an impossible property would finally end. The actual demolition days were often traumatic. Family members who attended watched in silence as structures where they'd been born, married, celebrated generations of life were systematically destroyed. Those who stayed away often regretted it later, haunted by the absence of closure. Public reaction was initially muted. Post-war Britain was focused on rebuilding bombed cities, constructing council housing, establishing the welfare state. Country houses seemed like anachronistic luxuries while people lived in temporary prefabs. But as the demolitions accelerated through the 1950s, concern grew. Architectural historians began cataloguing what was being lost. The Georgian Group, the Victorian Society, and similar organizations mobilized to save threatened buildings. The National Trust expanded its country house program dramatically, though it remained selective. It couldn't and wouldn't save everything. The turning point came in the 1970s with growing public awareness of heritage value and the establishment of stricter listing protections for historic buildings. Demolition became more difficult legally, though financial pressure remained. By then, however, the damage was done. Britain had lost approximately a third of its country houses since 1900. The survivors were the exceptions houses with sufficient resources, flexible families, or fortunate circumstances. The destroyed were the norm, and what was lost wasn't just architecture. It was craftsmanship, history, beauty, things that, once gone, could never be recovered. The National Trust offered a bargain. The family could transfer the house, the land, and enough of an endowment to cover basic costs. In exchange, the trust would maintain the property, open it to the public, and allow the family to continue living there, usually in a private apartment carved out of the former servants' quarters. For families facing demolition or forced sale, this was often the only option that kept the house standing. But it came at a price: privacy, control. The house stopped being fully theirs. Tourists walked through bedrooms where their grandparents had slept. Roped-off corridors became public corridors. Schedules were dictated by opening hours. Decisions about maintenance, about what to display, about how to present the house's history. Those decisions now belong to the trust, not the family. Some adapted well. They became partners in preservation, working with the trust to keep the houses alive. Others found it unbearable and left entirely, unable to watch strangers treat their homes as museums. For houses that stayed in private hands, survival required transformation. Chatsworth became a tourist attraction, but one still managed by the family. The Duke and Duchess of Devonshire turned the estate into a business, opening a farm shop, hosting events, licensing the house for films. Blenheim Palace, birthplace of Winston Churchill, became one of Britain's most visited stately homes, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. The families who succeeded were the ones willing to swallow pride, to accept that the age of private grandeur was over, that the only way to keep these houses alive was to share them, to monetize them, to turn history into product. It was pragmatic, it was necessary, but it was also a profound shift. The castles survived. The way of life they represented did not. The National Trust's country house scheme, formalized in the 1930s and expanded dramatically after the war, became the primary mechanism for saving architecturally significant properties. But acceptance into the scheme was neither automatic nor easy. The trust required not just the house, but sufficient endowment to maintain it, typically millions of pounds in land, investments, or cash. For families already stripped bare by death duties, raising this endowment often meant liquidating whatever remained, selling more art, more land, accepting loans against future income. The 11th Duke of Devonshire transferred Hardwicke Hall to the trust in 1959, but only after decades of negotiation and financial maneuvering. The Lascelles family gave Harewood House to the trust in partial settlement of death duties in 1986, retaining the right to live there, but surrendering ultimate control. The loss of privacy was immediate and comprehensive. Rooms that had been intimate family spaces became exhibit halls. Personal possessions were catalogued, labeled, interpreted for public consumption. Family members learned to navigate their own homes via back staircases and service corridors, avoiding the public routes. Mealtimes were scheduled around tour groups. Renovations required trust approval and had to respect historical authenticity. You couldn't simply modernize a bathroom if it meant destroying Georgian fixtures. Some families found the arrangement suffocating and eventually moved out entirely, maintaining only nominal connection to properties their ancestors had built. For those who retained private ownership, commercialization became survival strategy. The 11th Duke of Devonshire, inheriting Chatsworth in 1950, facing £7 million in death duties, made a calculated decision to embrace tourism fully. He opened the house extensively, invested in visitor facilities, marketed aggressively. His wife, Deborah Mitford, became the public face of Chatsworth, writing books, giving interviews, cultivating an accessible aristocratic image that drew visitors. The estate diversified, a farm shop selling produce from estate farms, a garden centre, event hosting for weddings and corporate functions, filming location fees from period dramas. By the 1990s, Chatsworth attracted over 600,000 visitors annually and operated as a profitable business. But this required constant management, commercial savvy, and willingness to treat a family home as a heritage brand. Blenheim Palace took commercialization even further. The 11th Duke of Marlborough, inheriting in 1972, invested heavily in visitor infrastructure, restaurants, gift shops, parking facilities, a miniature railway, a maze. The palace hosted concerts, Christmas markets, food festivals. The Churchill connection was marketed extensively. Visitors came to see where Britain's wartime leader was born, and the palace provided that experience at premium prices. Annual visitor numbers exceeded 800,000. Revenue sustained the building's maintenance and provided the family with income. But the palace ceased being primarily a home and became primarily an attraction where a family happened to live. Other families pursued alternative strategies. Longleat's Marquess of Bath introduced safari animals to the grounds in 1966, the first drive-through safari park outside Africa. It seemed absurd, undignified, a betrayal of heritage. It also worked brilliantly, generating millions in revenue and making Longleat one of England's top tourist attractions. Woburn Abbey followed with a similar safari park. These innovations were controversial within aristocratic circles. Some viewed them as creative adaptation, others as vulgar commercialization that degraded historic properties into theme parks. The aristocratic families who succeeded in this new environment shared certain characteristics: business acumen, willingness to innovate, ability to separate sentiment from economics, and enough remaining capital to invest in tourist infrastructure before returns materialized. Those who failed typically clung to older notions of privacy and dignity, refused commercialization as beneath them, or simply lacked the resources to make necessary investments. Many of these families eventually sold to institutions, corporations, or wealthy individuals who converted the houses to hotels, corporate headquarters, or private clubs. What emerged by the 1980s was a bifurcated landscape. A minority of houses survived as living entities, either managed by families as businesses or preserved by the National Trust with family involvement. The majority were gone, converted or fundamentally transformed beyond recognition. The survivors proved that country houses could persist into the modern era, but only by abandoning nearly everything that had originally defined them. Privacy, exclusivity, the assumption that great wealth supported effortless maintenance. The price of preservation was perpetual performance, endless monetization, and acceptance that these houses now belonged, in practical terms, to everyone and no one. Violet Jessop polished silver in the butler's pantry of a country house in Yorkshire. That was 1910. By 1920, she was working in a factory in Leeds, earning twice what she'd made in service, with evenings and Sundays off. She never went back. Her story was repeated thousands of times. The great houses required armies of servants. Chatsworth had 300. Blenheim had 200. Even smaller estates employed 50 or more. Housemaids, footmen, cooks, kitchen maids, hall boys, stable hands, gamekeepers, gardeners. An entire economy built on low wages and long hours, sustained by a class system that told people from birth what their place was and kept them there. The First World War cracked that system. Young men who survived the trenches refused to return to polishing boots. Young women who had worked in munitions factories, driven ambulances, filled roles that society had once told them were impossible. They wouldn't go back to scrubbing floors for a family that didn't know their names. Wages rose. Conditions improved, but not enough. By the 1920s, the servant shortage was a constant complaint among aristocratic families. By the 1940s, it was a crisis. And by the 1960s, the idea that a family could casually employ dozens of full-time servants was a fantasy. The people who had made the castles function, who lit the fires, cooked the meals, washed the linens, maintained the illusion of effortless grandeur, were gone. Some found better work, some emigrated, some aged out and weren't replaced. The invisible infrastructure that had sustained aristocratic life for centuries simply evaporated. The houses didn't just lose their wealth. They lost the labor force that had made wealth livable. The numbers tell a stark story. In 1891, domestic service employed approximately 1.4 million people. In England and Wales, the single largest occupation category for women. By 1931, that figure had dropped to around 1.1 million despite population growth. By 1951, it was roughly 750,000. By 1971, perhaps 200,000 remained, mostly in specialized roles or working for institutions rather than private families. The collapse was generational and irreversible. Daughters of housemaids who might once have automatically followed their mothers into service chose shop work, clerical positions, factory jobs, anything that offered independence, fixed hours, and dignity. The war experience accelerated what economic forces had already begun. Women who worked in munitions factories earned £3 to £5 per week, vastly more than the £12 to £18 per year, typical for housemaids. They lived independently, set their own schedules outside work hours, weren't subject to constant supervision. When the war ended and factories contracted, many women did return to some form of domestic work, but the terms had changed. They demanded day positions coming in to clean or cook, but returning to their own homes at night. They refused to wear uniforms. They insisted on being called by their names rather than generic titles like the maid. Most fundamentally, they refused to accept the subordination that residential service had always required. Men had even more alternatives. Returning soldiers found work in expanding industries: automotive, electrical, construction. The government's Homes Fit for Heroes program created construction jobs. Public sector employment grew. Working as a footman or hall boy, positions that required physical deference and performance of civility, became psychologically impossible for men who had commanded troops or operated complex machinery under fire. Gamekeeping and gardening roles, which offered more autonomy and outdoor work, survived longer, but even these became harder to fill as rural depopulation continued. The aristocratic families tried to adapt. They raised wages, sometimes doubling or tripling pre-war rates. They installed modern conveniences: electric lights instead of candles, central heating instead of individual fireplaces to reduce labor requirements. They relaxed rules about followers, time off, and living conditions. Some allowed married servants, previously forbidden. None of it was enough. The fundamental equation had changed. Why would a young woman accept £40 per year, a shared attic room, and 6:30 a.m.? Starts when she could earn £100 in an office, live in her own flat, and have weekends free. The personal accounts from former servants reveal the transformation. They describe service before the war with mixed feelings: hard work and subordination, yes, but also security, community, clear expectations. But they described the post-war period differently. They had seen alternatives. They had tasted independence. Going back felt like voluntary imprisonment. One former housemaid, interviewed in the 1970s, said simply, "Once you'd worked in the factory, once you'd had your own money and your own time, you couldn't go back to someone else controlling every minute of your day. You just couldn't." The practical consequences for the great houses were immediate and devastating. Tasks that had been routine became impossible. Lighting and maintaining 30 fireplaces each morning, you needed staff for that. Serving elaborate multi-course meals, you needed kitchen staff. Maintaining vast gardens, cleaning hundreds of windows, washing mountains of linens, all required bodies that simply weren't available at any price most families could afford. Families consolidated. They closed wings. They simplified meals. They reduced entertaining dramatically. The Duchess of Devonshire in the 1950s described shopping for her own groceries, something utterly inconceivable to her grandmother. Aristocratic children grew up making their own beds, helping with dishes, performing domestic tasks that would have scandalized earlier generations. The lifestyle that the houses had been designed to support became physically impossible to maintain because the human infrastructure no longer existed. This labor shortage, more than financial pressure alone, explains why so many houses became unlivable as private residences. You could theoretically afford to heat a 50-room mansion if you only heated 10 rooms. But you couldn't maintain the other 40 without staff. They deteriorated, damp spread. Roofs leaked, decay accelerated. The servants hadn't just provided convenience, they had provided the constant maintenance that kept these vast structures functional. When they left, the buildings began their slow collapse, regardless of how much money the families had or didn't have. For 1,000 years, Britain's aristocracy had defended their position with a simple argument. They were stewards, guardians of the land, protectors of tradition, patrons of art and architecture. Their wealth, they insisted, wasn't hoarded, it was invested in beauty, in culture, in maintaining estates that employed hundreds and sustained entire villages. There was some truth to this. Country houses were centers of local economies. Estate workers had jobs, housing, and a kind of security that harsh industrial labor often lacked. And many aristocrats did take their responsibilities seriously, managing land carefully, funding churches, schools, hospitals. But the collapse revealed the other side. That the system only worked when money kept flowing upward. That the beauty of the great houses was built and maintained by people who would never live in rooms like that, who worked dawn to dusk for wages that kept them perpetually one crisis away from destitution. That the art and architecture, however magnificent, existed because of an economic structure that concentrated wealth in very few hands. When the taxes came, when the agricultural rents failed, when death duties forced families to sell, the aristocracy framed it as tragedy, the destruction of heritage, the loss of irreplaceable beauty. And it was those things, but it was also something else. The unwinding of a system that had taken enormous amounts of resources, land, labor, capital, and funneled them toward the comfort and status of a tiny elite. The castles fell because the country decided, through democratic process, through taxation, through policy, that this was no longer a defensible way to organize society. Was it perfect? No. The demolitions were often wasteful. The loss of architectural masterpieces was real. Better policy might have saved more. But the core shift from aristocratic wealth concentration to a more distributed economy was not an accident or a mistake. It was a choice. Britain chose the welfare state over the great estates. It chose universal health care, public education, and social safety nets over preserving a class system built on inherited land. The castles were beautiful. The costs were brutal. And when the bill finally came due, the society that had sustained them for centuries decided the price was no longer worth paying. The stewardship argument deserves examination because it wasn't entirely fabricated. Many aristocratic families did maintain their estates across generations with genuine care. The 6th Duke of Devonshire spent enormous sums on Chatsworth's gardens and collections, not for personal pleasure alone, but believing he was preserving something for posterity. The agricultural improvements introduced by progressive landowners in the 18th and 19th centuries, crop rotation, drainage systems, selective breeding genuinely increased productivity and benefited tenant farmers. Village schools, almshouses, and churches funded by landed families provided real social goods. The patronage that supported architects like Capability Brown, artists like Reynolds and Gainsborough, craftsmen who created furniture and plasterwork of extraordinary quality. This created beauty that outlasted the patrons. But stewardship operated within a framework of profound inequality. The workers who built the houses, maintained the gardens, and created the beauty worked for subsistence wages with minimal rights. A housemaid earning £15 per year in 1910 might work 16-hour days, sleep in an unheated attic, and have one afternoon off per week. A tenant farmer paying £50 annual rent on land his family had worked for generations had no security of tenure. He could be evicted at will if the landowner decided to consolidate farms or convert to parkland. The system functioned through deference enforced by economic dependence. Workers accepted subordinate positions because alternatives were worse or non-existent. The collapse forced a confrontation with these contradictions. When aristocratic families faced financial crisis, the language they used was revealing. They spoke of heritage destroyed, tradition lost, family patrimony squandered, but rarely acknowledged that the patrimony was itself accumulated through systems of extraction. The rents that funded the great houses came from tenant farmers. The labor that maintained them came from servants earning a fraction of their employer's income. The capital that purchased the art came from agricultural profits generated by others' work. This doesn't mean every aristocrat was cruel or every estate exploitative, but it does mean the system had structural inequities built into its foundation. The tax policies that precipitated the collapse were democratic choices, reflecting changing values. Lloyd George's People's Budget passed because elected representatives voted for it. Death duties increased because governments, answerable to broader constituencies than landed interests alone, decided concentrated wealth should be redistributed. These weren't arbitrary confiscations, they were legislative decisions made through constitutional processes. The aristocracy had political power and used it to resist, But they lost because democratic politics shifted toward mass enfranchisement and away from property-based privilege. The outcomes were mixed. Britain gained the National Health Service, universal education, unemployment insurance, old age pensions, social goods that required tax revenue. The money that might have preserved every country house instead funded hospitals and schools. Was this the right choice? Most Britons in 1945 would have answered yes without hesitation. A population that had endured depression and war wanted security, healthcare, housing, not preservation of aristocratic palaces. The political consensus supported redistribution over heritage conservation. Yet the architectural and cultural losses were real and permanent. Houses demolished in the 1950s could have been saved with different policies: public acquisition, subsidized preservation, tax incentives for maintenance. Countries like France and Italy preserved more of their heritage properties through state intervention. Britain's approach was more laissez-faire. Tax the estates heavily, let families decide whether to struggle on or sell, let the market determine outcomes. This preserved some houses but destroyed many others. A more deliberate preservation policy might have saved more without abandoning social welfare commitments. The moral complexity lies here. Both things are true. The country houses represented extraordinary beauty, craftsmanship, and cultural heritage worth preserving, and they represented a social order built on inequality that Britain legitimately chose to dismantle. The collapse wasn't simply heritage destruction by Philistine bureaucrats. It was the working out of fundamental tensions between historic preservation and social justice, between aesthetic value and economic equity, between tradition and democracy. The castles fell because maintaining them required either perpetuating the inequality that had originally funded them or finding alternative funding mechanisms that Britain, facing massive post-war reconstruction needs, chose not to prioritize. The tragedy was real. So was the choice. And the choice, viewed from the perspective of those who had served in the houses rather than owned them, was defensible. For 1,000 years, Britain's aristocracy had defended their position with a simple argument. They were stewards, guardians of the land, protectors of tradition, patrons of art and architecture. Their wealth, they insisted, wasn't hoarded, it was invested in beauty, in culture, in maintaining estates that employed hundreds and sustained entire villages. There was some truth to this. Country houses were centers of local economies. Estate workers had jobs, housing, and a kind of security that harsh industrial labor often lacked. And many aristocrats did take their responsibilities seriously, managing land carefully, funding churches, schools, hospitals. But the collapse revealed the other side, that the system only worked when money kept flowing upward, that the beauty of the great houses was built and maintained by people who would never live in rooms like that, who worked dawn to dusk for wages that kept them perpetually one crisis away from destitution, that the art and architecture, however magnificent, existed because of an economic structure that concentrated wealth in very few hands. When the taxes came, when the agricultural rents failed, when death duties forced families to sell, the aristocracy framed it as tragedy, the destruction of heritage, the loss of irreplaceable beauty. And it was those things, but it was also something else. The unwinding of a system that had taken enormous amounts of resources, land, labor, capital, and funneled them toward the comfort and status of a tiny elite. The castles fell because the country decided, through democratic process, through taxation, through policy, that this was no longer a defensible way to organize society. Was it perfect? No. The demolitions were often wasteful. The loss of architectural masterpieces was real. Better policy might have saved more. But the core shift from aristocratic wealth concentration to a more distributed economy was not an accident or a mistake. It was a choice. Britain chose the welfare state over the great estates. It chose universal healthcare, public education, and social safety nets over preserving a class system built on inherited land. The castles were beautiful, the costs were brutal, and when the bill finally came due, the society that had sustained them for centuries decided the price was no longer worth paying. The stewardship argument deserves examination because it wasn't entirely fabricated. Many aristocratic families did maintain their estates across generations with genuine care. The sixth Duke of Devonshire spent enormous sums on Chatsworth's gardens and collections not for personal pleasure alone, but believing he was preserving something for posterity. The agricultural improvements introduced by progressive landowners in the 18th and 19th centuries, crop rotation, drainage systems, selective breeding, genuinely increased productivity and benefited tenant farmers. Village schools, almshouses and churches funded by landed families provided real social goods. The patronage that supported architects like Capability Brown, artists like Reynolds and Gainsborough, craftsmen who created furniture and plasterwork of extraordinary quality. This created beauty that outlasted the patrons. But stewardship operated within a framework of profound inequality. The workers who built the houses, maintained the gardens, and created the beauty worked for subsistence wages with minimal rights. A housemaid earning £15 per year in 1910 might work 16-hour days, sleep in an unheated attic, and have one afternoon off per week. A tenant farmer paying £50 annual rent on land his family had worked for generations had no security of tenure. He could be evicted at will if the landowner decided to consolidate farms or convert to parkland. The system functioned through deference enforced by economic dependence. Workers accepted subordinate positions because alternatives were worse or non-existent. The collapse forced a confrontation with these contradictions. When aristocratic families faced financial crisis, the language they used was revealing. They spoke of heritage destroyed, tradition lost, family patrimony squandered, but rarely acknowledged that the patrimony was itself accumulated through systems of extraction. The rents that funded the great houses came from tenant farmers. The labor that maintained them came from servants earning a fraction of their employer's income. The capital that purchased the art came from agricultural profits generated by others' work. This doesn't mean every aristocrat was cruel or every estate exploitative, but it does mean the system had structural inequities built into its foundation. The tax policies that precipitated the collapse were democratic choices reflecting changing values. Lloyd George's People's Budget passed because elected representatives voted for it. Death duties increased because governments, answerable to broader constituencies than landed interests alone, decided concentrated wealth should be redistributed. These weren't arbitrary confiscations, they were legislative decisions made through constitutional processes. The aristocracy had political power and used it to resist, but they lost because democratic politics shifted toward mass enfranchisement and away from property-based privilege. The outcomes were mixed. Britain gained the National Health Service, universal education, unemployment insurance, old age pensions, social goods that required tax revenue. The money that might have preserved every country house instead funded hospitals and schools. Was this the right choice? Most Britons in 1945 would have answered yes without hesitation. A population that had endured depression and war wanted security, healthcare, housing, not preservation of aristocratic palaces. The political consensus supported redistribution over heritage conservation. Yet the architectural and cultural losses were real and permanent. Houses demolished in the 1950s could have been saved with different policies: public acquisition, subsidized preservation, tax incentives for maintenance. Countries like France and Italy preserved more of their heritage properties through state intervention. Britain's approach was more laissez-faire: tax the estates heavily, let families decide whether to struggle on or sell, let the market determine outcomes. This preserved some houses but destroyed many others. A more deliberate preservation policy might have saved more without abandoning social welfare commitments. The moral complexity lies here. Both things are true. The country houses represented extraordinary beauty, craftsmanship, and cultural heritage worth preserving. And they represented a social order built on inequality that Britain legitimately chose to dismantle. The collapse wasn't simply heritage destruction by Philistine bureaucrats. It was the working out of fundamental tensions between historic preservation and social justice, between aesthetic value and economic equity, between tradition and democracy. The castles fell because maintaining them required either perpetuating the inequality that had originally funded them or finding alternative funding mechanisms that Britain, facing massive post-war reconstruction needs, chose not to prioritize. The tragedy was real, so was the choice. And the choice, viewed from the perspective of those who had served in the houses rather than owned them, was defensible.